My name is Gerald Mercer. I'm 61 years old, and I spent 34 years as the only licensed electrician in Calverton, a small town in rural Tennessee where everybody knows which truck belongs to which driveway, and gossip travels faster than the county road ever did. I rewired half the homes on this mountain. I coached Little League for 11 years. I served on the volunteer fire department until my knee said otherwise. In Calverton, your name is the only currency that actually holds its value, and I had spent 6 decades making sure mine was solid. So when my former son-in-law walked up to me at my granddaughter's 7th birthday party, planted his feet like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his bathroom mirror, and said it loud enough for the Pattersons, the Delgados, and my own sister to hear, "Leaving your daughter was the best decision I ever made, old man," I didn't flinch. I just looked at him, set my cup of sweet tea down on the picnic table, slow and deliberate, the way you set down a tool when you're not finished with it yet. And I said, "Is that so?" Not a question, a receipt. Because 4 minutes earlier, I had gotten a text on my phone from a man I had quietly called 2 days before. One line, no explanation needed, and I already knew that everything Travis Holden had spent 2 years constructing on the wreckage of my daughter's life was about to meet the same fate as every cheap job I'd ever had to tear out and redo. Some things look finished until someone who knows what they're doing takes a closer look. Welcome to Dorian's Revenge Stories, where quiet men outlast loud ones and the truth never misses. It just takes its time finding the right room. If a story about a father, a small town, and a lie that finally ran out of road is what you came for tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. Pull up a chair. This one goes deep. Let me back up, because the words came before the truck pulled into the driveway. It was a cool Saturday in late October. My granddaughter Lily was turning 7, and my daughter Claire had done what she always does, made something out of nothing. Crepe paper streamers on the mailbox, a sheet cake from the recipe her grandmother left her, a hand-painted sign in the front yard in Lily's own crooked handwriting that said "Welcome to my birthday," and it was the most perfect thing I had seen in months. I had driven 40 minutes from my side of the county to be there. I would have driven 4 hours. What I had not planned on was Travis being there. The custody arrangement gave him every other Saturday, but he had missed so many in a row that Lily had quietly stopped watching the window for his truck. When he pulled up 20 minutes late, I said nothing. I watched Claire's shoulders drop half an inch. Then she straightened them, smoothed her apron, and went back to cutting cake. That is my daughter. She does not perform her pain for an audience. Travis moved through the backyard the way men do when they need people to notice their recovery. Louder than necessary, newer boots, a laugh just a half-second too long. He made his rounds, shook hands. At some point he drifted toward me near the back fence where I was standing alone, watching Lily chase her cousin with a paper plate. He stopped 2 feet away and looked me up and down. And then he said his piece, every word landing exactly where he aimed it. I picked up my sweet tea. I set it back down, and somewhere beyond the back fence, I heard the sound of a car door closing on the gravel lane that ran behind Claire's property. I didn't turn around yet, but I knew that lane. I had helped Claire's late mother plant the hedgerow along it, the summer before she passed. I knew every sound it made, and I knew exactly whose car I had asked to be parked there by 3 o'clock. Travis was still smiling, still waiting for me to crumble or swing or walk away. I did none of those things. If you want to know who got out of that car and what it meant for Travis Holden, stay right here with me. And before we go one step further, if this is the kind of story that reminds you why you never count a quiet man out, drop a comment right now and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Hit the like button, subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories, and turn on your notifications so you never miss what's coming next. We have more stories where this one came from, and trust me, you do not want to be the last one to know. Calverton is the kind of town where your reputation arrives at a place before you do. You walk into the hardware store and Dale behind the counter already knows your father owed someone money in 1987. You stop for gas and 3 people know where you're headed before you pull out of the lot. That cuts both ways. It means a good name travels far. It also means a lie, once released, moves through the whole town like smoke through a drafty house. Quiet, invisible, and into everything before you even smell it. Travis Holden had understood that from the beginning. I just didn't see it until it was already in the walls. He came into Claire's life 6 years ago. She was 32, running the books for a small medical practice in town, raising Lily mostly alone after a relationship that had ended before Lily's second birthday. Claire was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was organized, practical, funny in a dry way that snuck up on you, and she had her mother's habit of making every person in a room feel like the most important one there. She was doing fine. Better than fine, honestly. Travis showed up the way certain men do in small towns, from just far enough away to seem interesting. He'd grown up 2 counties over, worked in equipment sales, drove a clean truck, and had a handshake that made older men nod approvingly. He was charming the way a freshly painted porch is charming. It looks solid until you lean on it. I want to be fair to who he was in the beginning, because I think fairness matters even when it's uncomfortable. In those first 2 years, he was good to Claire, present for Lily. He came to Sunday dinners and helped me rehang a sagging gutter without being asked. He called me sir until I told him not to. There was a version of Travis Holden I genuinely liked, and I think that version was real. I just think it had an expiration date he never told anyone about. The change came in the 3rd year, subtle at first, the way foundation cracks are subtle. A canceled plan here, a sharp word there, that got smoothed over too quickly. Claire started qualifying things when she talked about him. He's just stressed with work, and he doesn't mean it the way it sounds. I'd heard that music before. Her mother and I had neighbors who played it for 15 years. But Claire was an adult, and it was her life. And I was her father, not her warden, so I watched. I stayed close, and I kept my mouth shut in the way that fathers learn to keep their mouths shut when they know that pushing too hard will only push their child further away. What I did not know yet, what none of us knew, was that Travis had already started telling a different story about Claire all over town. Not loudly, quietly, the worst kind. He was telling people she was unstable, that she was difficult to live with, that he was doing his best with a woman who could never be satisfied. He told it to his buddies at the equipment yard. He told it to a deacon at the church they'd started attending. He let it drift, casual as smoke, through every room Claire wasn't in. And in a town like Calverton, a quiet story told by a friendly man in clean boots carries further than a shout. By the time Claire found out what was being said about her, half the county had already decided the shape of her, and the man who'd built that shape was still sitting at her kitchen table every Sunday, smiling at me over sweet tea like he'd done nothing at all. That is the thing about a certain kind of cruelty. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly renovates the room while you're still living in it. Claire came to me on a Tuesday evening in February. She didn't call ahead, which told me everything before she said a word. She just knocked, walked in the way she had since she was 6 years old, sat down at my kitchen table, and put both hands flat on the surface, like she was steadying herself against something moving underneath her. She told me Travis had asked for a divorce. Not that it surprised me by then. The surprise had passed months earlier when I started noticing the small architecture of a man preparing to leave, the way he stopped including himself in future plans, the way he talked about Claire in the 3rd person, sometimes even when she was standing right there. I had seen the blueprint. I just hadn't said it out loud because I was still hoping I was wrong. What surprised me was what came next. Claire told me that in the 2 weeks since Travis had asked for the divorce, she had run into 3 separate people in town who already seemed to know. Not just that they were separating, but why. The version going around Calverton was tidy and cruel in the way that only a premeditated story can be. Claire was cold. Claire was controlling. Claire had always been more interested in her spreadsheets than her husband. Travis had tried his best for years, and a man can only give so much before he has to think about himself. 3 people, 2 weeks, before the papers were even filed. He had not left and then talked. He had talked and then left. The story had been seeded before the ground was even broken. That was the part that sat in my chest like a swallowed bolt. I did not say much that night. I made Claire a cup of coffee and I listened, which is the most useful thing a father can do when his daughter is bleeding and doesn't want to be fussed over. She was not crying. Claire cried the way she did everything, privately, on her own schedule, where nobody could use it against her. What she was, that night, was tired. The specific tiredness of a woman who has been quietly carrying a weight and just discovered it was never hers to carry in the first place. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about the deacon at their church who had given me a careful look at the gas station the previous week. I thought about Dale at the hardware store who had been slightly too sympathetic when I mentioned Claire's name. I thought about Linda Patterson from 2 streets over who had stopped me in the Piggly Wiggly parking lot to say she was so sorry about everything in a tone that already had a verdict in it. The story was already everywhere. It was already load-bearing. People had already built their understanding of my daughter on top of it, and they were not going to dismantle that structure just because Claire asked them to. That is not how small towns work. That is not how people work. What I understood that night, sitting alone in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, was that Travis Holden had not just ended a marriage. He had done something more deliberate than that. He had ended it in advance. He had pre-demolished Claire's reputation so that when the walls came down, everyone in Calverton would look at the rubble and see her fingerprints on it instead of his. I pressed my thumb against the face of my father's old pocket watch, the one I carry in my left front pocket every single day. I have done it since I was 19 years old. My father gave it to me the morning I left for my first job and told me that a patient man always knows what time it is. That night, for the first time in a long time, I felt the watch ticking differently. Not like it was counting down to something, like it was counting up to it. There is a specific kind of anger that quiet men carry. It does not burn hot and fast. It does not need an audience. It settles in low and slow like a long fire, and it does not go out until the thing it is heating is finished. I had never in my life been a man who acted from rage. Every job I ever did right, I did right because I slowed down when other men sped up. But I want you to hear this clearly because I think some of you know exactly what I am describing. There is a line between enduring something and enabling it. Between being patient and being complicit. I had spent months on the patient side of that line. That Tuesday night in February, I crossed it. Not loudly, not visibly. Nobody watching me sit at that kitchen table would have seen anything change. But something had shifted underneath, deep in the foundation, the way things shift before a structure decides what it is actually going to do. Travis Holden had built something on my daughter's name, and I had just decided, quietly and completely, that I was going to take a very close look at what it was actually made of. Here is something they do not teach you about small towns. The same quality that makes them suffocating, the fact that everyone knows everyone else's everything, is also the very quality that makes them impossible to hide in permanently. A lie can travel fast in a place like Calverton, but so can a question asked by the right person in the right room. I did not move quickly. I want to be clear about that because the way a man moves matters as much as where he ends up. I had watched enough people blow up their own cases by getting loud and emotional and giving the other side something to point at. I was not going to be that man. I was going to be the man who shows up with documentation. The first thing I did was listen, properly, intentionally. I started paying attention in a way I had not before, not to the gossip itself, but to the shape of it. Where was it coming from? How consistent was it? Was it the organic, spreading kind that grows differently in every mouth? Or was it the planted kind that keeps the same specific details no matter who is telling it? It was the planted kind. I knew that within 2 weeks. Every version I heard had the same 3 elements. Claire was cold. Claire was controlling. Travis had been unhappy for years but had stayed for Lily's sake. 3 points. Same order. Same emphasis. Like talking points distributed before a meeting. Dale at the hardware store used the word controlling. The deacon at the church used the word controlling. A woman at the post office who had met Travis exactly twice used the word controlling. That is not how organic gossip spreads. Organic gossip mutates. It exaggerates. It adds details that were never in the original. What I was hearing was a rehearsed narrative, and a rehearsed narrative has an author. The second thing I did was talk to Lily's school. Not about Travis directly. Nothing adversarial. I simply made it known to her teacher and the school counselor that Claire and Travis were separating and that Lily might need some additional support. What came back to me, gently and carefully, was that Lily had said some things in class that gave her teacher pause. Things a 7-year-old should not know the vocabulary for. Words like unstable and episodes, used about her own mother, in a child's voice, with a child's unquestioning certainty. A 7-year-old does not generate that vocabulary independently. She hears it from adults she trusts, and she absorbs it the way children absorb everything, completely, without the filter that comes from experience. Travis had not just been planting seeds around Calverton. He had been planting them in his own daughter's mind. That was the moment I stopped feeling anything that resembled patience toward him. I kept my face neutral. I thanked the counselor. I drove home and I sat with that information for 3 full days before I did anything with it. Because a man who acts from the hottest point of his anger rarely acts with precision, and precision was the only thing I was interested in. The third thing I did was make a phone call. His name was Roy Dempsey. Roy had been the county's most respected family law attorney for 22 years before he semi-retired to handle only the cases he felt like handling. He was 67 years old, drove a truck older than mine, and had a reputation in 3 counties for being the kind of lawyer who never raised his voice in a courtroom because he never needed to. He had grown up 4 miles from where I was sitting. We had gone to the same high school 30 years apart, and we had enough mutual respect built up over decades of small-town proximity that when I called, he answered on the second ring. I told him everything: the gossip campaign, the timeline of it, the vocabulary showing up in Lily's classroom, the divorce filing that came after the story had already been distributed. Roy listened without interrupting, which I had been told was rare for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gerald, what you're describing has a name. It's called a preemptive narrative strategy, and I have seen it used in custody cases more times than I want to count. The goal is to establish a public perception of the other parent before any legal proceedings begin, so that by the time you walk into a courtroom, the judge is the last person in the county to hear it." I pressed my thumb against my father's watch. "So what do we do about it?" I said. Roy's voice did not change. "We document everything we already have, and then we wait for Travis to make the mistake that men like him always make." "What mistake is that?" I said. "Believing," Roy said, "that because it worked so far, it will keep working." I hung up and went back to work. I had 3 jobs that week: a rewire in a farmhouse outside of town, a panel upgrade at the feed store, and a service call at the elementary school that turned into a half-day of tracing a fault in a 20-year-old circuit. I did all of it with steady hands and a very quiet mind. Because I had a lawyer, I had documentation, and I had something Travis Holden had never once considered giving me credit for. I had time. The mistake Roy had predicted came on a Thursday morning 4 months after the divorce was filed, in the form of a custody modification request that Travis submitted without telling Claire first. He wanted primary custody of Lily. Not joint, primary, with Claire reduced to every other weekend and 1 weeknight per month. The filing cited, in clean legal language, concerns about Claire's emotional stability, her fitness as a primary caregiver, and her history of creating a hostile home environment. It used the word unstable 4 times in 6 pages. It used the word controlling 3 times. The same vocabulary that had been moving through Calverton for months had now been dressed up in a suit and walked into a courthouse. I sat in Roy's office above the barbershop on Main Street and read every page twice. There is a specific feeling that comes when you finally see the whole blueprint of something that has been built against someone you love. It is not quite surprise. The surprise had passed months ago. It is something closer to a cold, clarifying anger, the kind that does not make you want to shout, but makes you want to be very, very precise. Claire was sitting beside me. She read it once, set it down on Roy's desk, and folded her hands in her lap. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Roy and said, "What do we do?" That is my daughter. Even with a 6-page document trying to reduce her to a footnote in her own child's life, she was already looking at the next move. Roy leaned back in his chair and did the thing I had come to recognize as his version of confidence. He got very still and very quiet, like a man who already knows the answer and is just deciding how much of it to share at once. "Here is the problem with what Travis has done," Roy said. "He has made a formal legal claim that Claire is an unfit and unstable parent. That claim is now on the record, which means we get to examine the evidence for it. And in examining the evidence for it, we get to ask where that narrative came from, when it started, and who was distributing it before any of this was ever filed." He let that land. "He built the story publicly," Roy continued, "and now he has tried to bring it into a courtroom. What he did not think through is that a courtroom is the one place where you have to prove what you say. A church potluck does not require evidence. A courthouse does." I pressed my thumb to my father's watch under the desk. I had carried that watch through 34 years of jobs that required me to find the fault nobody else could find. Bad wiring hides. It tucks itself behind walls and under floors and inside panels that look perfectly fine from the outside. But current always leaves a trace if you know how to look for it. Every short, every fault, every dangerous thing running unseen through a structure eventually shows itself to someone patient enough to follow the circuit all the way back to where it broke. Travis had been running a dangerous current through my daughter's life for 2 years, and he had just made the mistake of asking a courtroom to validate it. Roy filed the response that same week. It was measured and specific in the way that only a man with 22 years of practice can be measured and specific. It challenged each claim point by point. It introduced the timeline, the gossip campaign that preceded the divorce filing by months, the consistent vocabulary appearing across multiple unconnected sources, the language showing up in a 7-year-old's classroom before any legal proceedings had begun. It raised the question, formally and clearly, of whether the characterization of Claire as unstable was a genuine concern or a constructed narrative designed to influence a custody outcome. It also requested something that made Travis's lawyer go very quiet for several days. Communication records, text messages, emails, any documented correspondence between Travis and third parties in the 6 months prior to the divorce filing that referenced Claire's character, mental state, or fitness as a parent. Travis objected, loudly, through his lawyer, with a list of privacy arguments that Roy had apparently anticipated word for word because he had already prepared the counter to each one. When a man fights that hard to keep a door closed, it is usually because he knows what is on the other side of it. Roy called me on a Friday evening while I was finishing up a job at the feed store. I was on my back under a service panel, tracing a wire, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I finished the connection I was making. You do not leave a live circuit half done, and then I climbed out and called him back. The judge granted partial discovery, Roy said. We get the messages. I stood in the parking lot of the feed store, in the last of the October light, and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding since February. How long? I said. 3 weeks, Roy said. Maybe 4. I nodded even though he could not see me. I had waited 6 months. I could wait 4 more weeks. Patience is not weakness. Patience is a man who understands that the right moment has a shape, and you do not force it before it is ready. My father told me that. The watch in my pocket had been keeping that time my whole life. 3 weeks later, the messages arrived, and what was in them was worse than I had imagined, and more useful than I had hoped. Roy called me on a Wednesday morning and asked me to come to his office. Not a phone call conversation, in person. That distinction told me everything before I sat down. I drove into town, parked behind the barber shop, and climbed the stairs to his office. Roy was at his desk with a manila folder open in front of him and his reading glasses pushed up into his hair. He had the careful face of a man about to hand someone something heavy and wanted to make sure they were ready to hold it. He slid a single printed page across the desk, a summary. The full records were in the folder, but Roy, being Roy, had already understood that what I needed first was the shape of it before the details. I read it once, then I read it again. Travis had begun his campaign against Claire's reputation not after the marriage deteriorated, not after some breaking point, not in the grief of a man realizing a relationship had run its course. He had begun it 14 months before he filed for divorce. 14 months, while he was still sleeping in Claire's house, still sitting at her kitchen table, still handing Lily her lunchbox at the door every morning and waving from the driveway like a man with nothing to hide. The messages told the whole story in his own words. To his brother in Nashville, Claire's never going to change. I'm just laying the groundwork so when I finally pull the trigger, nobody's surprised. Sent 16 months ago. To a buddy from his equipment sales job, I need people to understand what living with her is actually like before I make my move. Nobody takes a man's word for it unless they've already heard it from somewhere else first. Sent 14 months ago. To the deacon at their church. I appreciate you keeping an eye on things. I just want people to know the real Claire before this all comes out. Sent 11 months ago. I sat in Roy's office and read those 3 messages 4 times, not because I did not understand them the first time, but because I needed the full weight of them to settle before I responded. This was not a man who had been unhappy and eventually broken. This was not a marriage that had failed, and a man who had processed it badly. This was a deliberate, documented, 14-month operation to dismantle my daughter's standing in her own community before she even knew the marriage was over. He had recruited her church. He had recruited his own social network. He had walked through Calverton for over a year, shaking hands and telling a story, while Claire sat in her house trusting him and raising his child. I pressed my thumb to my father's watch and held it there. Roy let me sit with it. He did not fill the silence. That is one of the things I had come to respect about him. When I finally looked up, I said, "How much of this is usable?" Roy took his glasses down from his hair and put them on. "All of it," he said. "Every word." He wrote it down himself, Gerald. In a custody case, a documented premeditated narrative campaign against the other parent is not a minor detail. It goes directly to character. It goes directly to his fitness, and it directly contradicts every claim he made in that modification request about being a concerned father acting in good faith. He paused. "There is something else," he said. He turned to the second page of the summary. Travis had also been messaging a woman in a neighboring county for the better part of a year. The messages were not ambiguous. The relationship had begun 8 months before the divorce was filed, while Travis was still publicly presenting himself as a devoted husband, doing his best with a difficult wife. I want to be careful here about what I felt in that moment, because I have thought about it many times since. I did not feel vindicated, not yet. What I felt was a profound and specific sadness for my daughter, who had spent years making herself smaller, quieter, more accommodating, trying to fix a marriage that the man across from her had already privately decided was over. While she was trying, he was planning. While she was hoping, he was messaging. All that effort, all that grace, spent on a closed door she did not know was closed. Roy filed the amended response 2 weeks later. It was a precise and thorough document that introduced the messages, established the timeline, and reframed the entire custody dispute in the light that the evidence actually supported. It did not editorialize. It did not need to. The messages spoke with the clarity that only a man's own words can speak. Travis's lawyer requested a delay, then another one. Roy told me that was a good sign. Men who are confident in their position, he said, do not keep asking for more time. Claire was steadier than I expected through all of it. Steadier than I would have been. She went to work every day. She picked Lily up from school. She came to my house on Sunday evenings and ate dinner and talked about everything except the case, which I had come to understand was her way of protecting the part of herself that the case could not touch. One Sunday evening in late September, she helped me clear the table and she stopped in the kitchen doorway and said, without looking at me, "Dad, whatever you're doing, thank you." I did not make a big thing of it, I just nodded and handed her a dish towel. But I held that moment in my chest the whole drive home. That quiet thank you from a woman who had been told for 2 years by the man she trusted that she was the problem, my daughter, who had never once been the problem. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of October, which is how I ended up standing at a picnic table in Claire's backyard on a cool Saturday afternoon 4 days before that hearing, setting down a cup of sweet tea, listening to Travis Holden tell me that leaving her was the best decision he ever made, and waiting for the sound of a car door closing on the gravel lane behind the hedge. The man who got out of that car on the gravel lane was named Patrick Osei. He was 44 years old, a forensic accountant by trade, and the quietest, devastatingly competent person I had met in my 61 years on this earth. Patrick had grown up 2 streets over from me. We had known each other since he was 11 years old and used to hand me tools when I let him watch me work on weekend mornings. He had gone on to build a career reconstructing the financial histories of people who did not want their financial histories reconstructed. I had called Patrick 3 weeks earlier, not officially, not as a hired professional, just as a man I trusted, asking him to look at something that had been bothering me. Because here is the thing about Travis Holden that Roy's discovery had cracked open but not fully answered. The messages explained the narrative campaign, they explained the timing, they explained the relationship in the neighboring county, but they did not explain the money. Claire had come to me 6 weeks earlier with something that had been nagging at her. In the process of separating their finances, she had found gaps she could not account for. Not large dramatic gaps, small careful ones. The kind that a person who is not a trained accountant might spend months staring at, without being able to name what they were looking at. 3 modest withdrawals from a joint savings account over 14 months. each one just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic notification to both account holders. A business expense account that had been opened in Travis's name only, attached to their joint tax filing in a way that reduced their shared refund 2 years running. A retirement contribution that had been quietly redirected. None of it was enormous. All of it was deliberate. Patrick had spent 2 weeks looking at it, and on that Saturday morning, 4 hours before Lily's birthday party, he had sent me a text message. One line. "You were right. Come find me after." That was the text I had in my pocket when Travis planted his feet in Claire's backyard and told me leaving her was the best decision he ever made. That was what I already knew when I set down my sweet tea and said, "Is that so?" without moving a muscle in my face. That was what was parked on the gravel lane behind the hedgerow while Travis stood in the yard he no longer lived in, performing his recovery for an audience of neighbors and relatives. He had no idea Patrick was 40 feet away. He had no idea that the financial picture Patrick had spent 2 weeks reconstructing told a story that made the custody filing look like the least of his problems. I want you to understand something about this moment, because I think it matters. I did not feel powerful standing there. I did not feel clever or superior or any of the things you might expect a man to feel when he is holding information that is about to change everything. What I felt was tired. A deep, specific tiredness that comes from watching someone you love absorb damage for years and being unable to stop it in the ways that mattered most. Travis was still talking. I had stopped hearing the words. I was watching his mouth move and thinking about Claire straightening her shoulders at that picnic table when his truck pulled up, about Lily's birthday sign with the misspelled welcome, about my father's watch ticking in my pocket through 14 months of a man's documented planning and 2 years of my daughter's undeserved shame. Travis finished whatever he was saying. He smiled the smile of a man who believed he had landed something. I looked at him for a long moment. "Travis," I said quietly, "how are your finances?" The smile stayed on his face for exactly 2 seconds after I said it. Then something moved behind his eyes, something small and quick, like a light switching off in a back room of a house, there and gone. But I saw it. 34 years of tracing faults through walls taught me to see the small things. He recovered fast. Men like Travis always recover fast on the surface. "Fine," he said. "Better than ever, actually." I nodded slowly. "Good," I said. "That's good." I picked up my sweet tea. I turned toward the party. "Enjoy the cake," I said over my shoulder. I walked across the yard to where Patrick was coming through the side gate, nodding once at me the way men nod when the work is done and the findings are what they expected. I shook his hand. We moved to the far corner of the yard near the old oak tree, where Lily's swing set had been standing since she was 3 years old. Patrick opened a folder. I did not look back at Travis. I did not need to. Behind me I could hear the birthday party continuing, children laughing, someone's aunt asking for more cake. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary Saturday in a small Tennessee town where everybody knows everybody and nothing stays hidden forever. Patrick pointed to the first page. And the full picture of what Travis Holden had been doing with money that half belonged to my daughter began to come into focus, the way a fault in a circuit comes into focus when you finally follow the wire all the way back to where it broke. Some things, once you see them clearly, cannot be unseen. And some decisions, once they are made quietly by a patient man with the right documentation and 4 days until a courthouse hearing, have a way of changing the temperature of an entire room. Travis was still in the yard behind me, still at the party, still performing. He had no idea the performance was already over. The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the Calverton County Courthouse, a building I had driven past 10,000 times without ever expecting to sit inside of. It was smaller than courtrooms on television. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, rows of benches that smelled like old varnish and central heating. The kind of room that does not care about your feelings and only wants to know what you can prove. I sat behind Claire and Roy at the front table. Patrick sat beside me with his folder. Travis was across the aisle with his lawyer, a young man from the city who wore shoes that did not belong in Calverton and had spent the previous 4 days filing delay requests that the judge had denied one after another with increasing brevity. The room filled in the way small-town courtrooms fill. Word had traveled, the way word always travels in Calverton, and the benches behind us held more people than a custody modification hearing typically draws. Two women from Claire's office, the school counselor who had flagged Lily's vocabulary 4 months earlier, the deacon from Travis's church, there for reasons I suspected had more to do with curiosity than support. Dale from the hardware store, which genuinely surprised me, and in the back row, very still and very watchful, 3 people I did not recognize who turned out to be, as Roy later told me, representatives from the County Family Services Office who had been quietly made aware of the proceedings. Travis sat with his lawyer and did not look at Claire. He had the careful composure of a man who had rehearsed his version of events so many times he had started to believe them. The judge was a woman named Honorable Margaret Briggs. She had been on the bench in this county for 16 years. Roy had told me 2 things about her. First, that she had seen every variety of custody manipulation in 16 years and could identify the shape of it the way an experienced mechanic identifies an engine sound. Second, that she did not raise her voice, ever, and that the quieter she got, the more trouble someone was in. She called the hearing to order and the room went still. Roy did not perform. That is what I remember most. He built the case the way I build a circuit, methodically, one connection at a time, making sure each element was properly grounded before moving to the next. He established Claire's history as Lily's primary caregiver, her consistency, her employment, her involvement in Lily's school and medical care. He established the timeline of the marriage and the divorce filing. He was unhurried and precise, and the room was very quiet. Then he introduced the messages. He read 3 of them aloud, not dramatically, in the same flat, even tone he had used for everything else. Laying groundwork, making sure Claire's timeline. I need people to understand what living with her is actually like before I make my move. I just want people to know the real Claire before this all comes out. The deacon in the back row shifted in his seat. Travis's lawyer objected twice. The judge overruled him both times with a single word each time. Overruled. The second time she said it, she looked at the lawyer over her glasses in a way that made him sit back and straighten his notes and say nothing further for several minutes. Then Roy introduced Patrick. Patrick took the stand with his folder and his quiet competence and spent 22 minutes walking the court through the financial reconstruction with the patience of a man who has explained complicated things to non-specialists for 20 years. 3 withdrawals below notification threshold. The redirected retirement contribution. The business expense account. The cumulative impact on the marital estate over 14 months. The total was not enormous in the way that headlines are enormous, but it was specific and documented and deliberate, and in the context of a man who had simultaneously been running a premeditated narrative campaign against his wife's reputation, it told a story about character that no amount of clean boots and firm handshakes could contradict. Travis's lawyer tried. I will give him that. He challenged Patrick's methodology, questioned the timeline, suggested alternative explanations for each transaction. Patrick answered every question with the same undisturbed calm, citing page numbers and account dates from memory, never once getting flustered or defensive. He simply kept following the wire back to where it broke and showing the court exactly what was there. I watched Travis through all of it. He held his composure through the messages. He held it through the financial testimony. He was good at composure. He had been practicing it for years in Claire's kitchen while building a case against her in other people's living rooms. But there is a moment in every structure under stress when something gives. Not always loudly. Sometimes it is just a settling. A small, irreversible shift that tells you the load is no longer being carried the way it was designed to be carried. Travis's moment came when Judge Briggs set down her pen, removed her glasses, and looked directly at him across the courtroom. She did not raise her voice. She simply said, "Mr. Holden, you have submitted to this court that your daughter's mother is emotionally unstable and unfit for primary custody. You have asked me to reduce her parenting time to 4 days per month, based on that characterization. I have now reviewed documentation showing that characterization was constructed and distributed by you, in your own words, 14 months before this filing, while you were still residing in the family home." She paused. "I want to give you an opportunity to help me understand that." Travis looked at his lawyer. His lawyer looked at his notes. The room was so quiet I could hear the fluorescent light above the jury box humming. Travis said, "It wasn't like that." Judge Briggs put her glasses back on. She picked up her pen. She wrote something on the page in front of her, and the sound of that pen moving across that paper was the loudest thing in the room. She did not ask him to elaborate. She did not need to. Behind me, I heard the deacon exhale slowly. I heard Dale from the hardware store shift on the wooden bench. I heard 14 months of a manufactured story settling into the ground under the weight of the truth that had finally been said aloud in the one room where saying something false has a cost. I pressed my thumb against my father's watch in my pocket. It was ticking steadily, the way it always had, patient as a man who knew the right moment was coming and had never once doubted it would arrive. Judge Briggs issued her ruling 9 days after the hearing. Roy called me on a Tuesday morning while I was finishing a panel upgrade at a farmhouse outside of town. I climbed down from the ladder, walked out to the porch, and stood in the cold November air while he read me the key points. Primary custody remained with Claire, unchanged. Travis's modification request was denied in its entirety. The judge's written ruling noted, in formal legal language that nonetheless carried the weight of a verdict the whole county would eventually read, that the evidence presented did not support the characterization of Claire Mercer as an unstable or unfit parent. It noted further that the documented pattern of premeditated reputational damage, directed at the primary caregiver, raised serious concerns about the petitioner's judgment and good faith. Travis's visitation was restructured under a supervised arrangement, pending a further review in 6 months. The financial irregularities were referred to a separate proceeding for full accounting and potential restitution. I stood on that farmhouse porch and listened to Roy read every word. When he finished, I thanked him. He said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "Gerald, I have been doing this for 22 years. The ones that end right are the ones where somebody was patient enough to follow the whole circuit. You followed it." I hung up and stood there for another minute in the cold air, looking out at the tree line the way I have looked at tree lines my whole life, when I needed to let something settle before I went back to work. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering at the end of a story like this. What I felt was something quieter and more permanent than triumph. Relief, partly. But underneath the relief, something that felt almost like grief. For the years my daughter had spent absorbing a wound that was never hers. For the version of her marriage she had tried so hard to save, while the man across from her was already 3 moves ahead. For the Lily who had learned the word unstable before she learned her multiplication tables and would need time and patience and good people around her to unlearn it. Triumph is loud and temporary. What I felt was the specific quiet of a thing that has been set right after a long time being wrong. It does not announce itself, it just settles, like a structure finally sitting level on a foundation that was rebuilt properly. Let me tell you what happened to everyone, because I know that is what you want to know. And I think you have earned it by staying with me this long. Travis left Calverton within 3 months of the ruling. He moved to Nashville, where his brother lived, in a city large enough that a man can start a new story without the old one following him room to room. I do not wish him harm. I genuinely do not. But I will tell you that I do not think about him much, which is its own kind of completion. A man who spent 2 years needing to be the most important presence in every room he entered has become someone I simply do not think about. There is a justice in that, quieter than anything a courtroom delivers. Carol Patterson, who had been the primary carrier of Travis's story through the church circle and the Piggly Wiggly parking lot and every potluck in a 12-mile radius, went very quiet after the hearing. Not because I said a single word against her, I never did, but because in a town where everyone knows everything, the truth of what Travis had done moved through Calverton as fast as his lie ever had. Carol had not been cruel on purpose. She had been used. She had carried a story she believed because a charming man in clean boots had handed it to her with confidence, and she had never thought to ask him to prove it. I felt a small and genuine sadness for her. She had spent years as the distributor of a lie, wearing her own voice. That is a hard thing to sit with when the truth finally arrives. The deacon called Roy's office 2 weeks after the ruling. He did not leave a detailed message. Just his name and a request to speak with someone about a character reference he wished he had not given. Roy told me that. I told Roy to tell him that no response was necessary. Some accountings happen inside a man's own conscience and do not need my participation. Dale from the hardware store, who had given me that careful look at the gas station all those months ago, stopped me outside his store on a December morning and shook my hand for longer than a handshake usually lasts. He did not say much. He is not a man of many words. which is something I have always respected about him. He just nodded and said, "Glad it came out right, Gerald." That was enough. That was more than enough. Claire got a promotion at the medical practice 3 months after the ruling. She called to tell me on a Sunday evening, and there was something in her voice I had not heard in 2 years. Not happiness exactly, though she was happy. It was the sound of a woman who had gotten her footing back, who was standing on ground that was actually hers and knew it. She brought Lily to my house for dinner that Sunday, and Lily sat at my kitchen table and drew pictures, while Claire and I drank coffee and talked about everything and nothing the way we used to, before all of this started. At some point, Lily looked up from her drawing and said, without any context, "Grandpa, did you know that welcome has an E at the end?" I looked at Claire. Claire pressed her lips together, trying not to smile. "I did know that," I said, "but I liked your sign the way it was." Lily considered this seriously, the way 7-year-olds consider things. Then she went back to her drawing, satisfied. I held that moment in my chest the whole evening. The financial proceeding concluded 4 months later. Travis was required to make full restitution to the marital estate. The amount was returned to Claire, which helped her put a new roof on the house she had been worrying about since spring. She sent me a picture the day the roofers finished. Just the house in the afternoon light with a text underneath that said, "Solid foundation." I still have that picture on my phone. I carry my father's watch every single day. Left front pocket, same as always. I pressed my thumb to its face through every chapter of this story, in Roy's office and Patrick's folder, and that farmhouse porch, and every quiet moment in between when I needed to remember that patience is not waiting. Patience is knowing the right moment when it comes and being ready to meet it without flinching. The right moment came, I met it, and then I set it down, the way my father always said a good man sets things down when the work is finished, not with ceremony, not with noise, just with the clean and quiet satisfaction of a job done right. I want to leave you with one thing before I go, because I think some of you watching this tonight are in the middle of a story that has not reached its right moment yet. Maybe someone has been writing a version of you in rooms you were never in. Maybe a lie about you is load-bearing in someone else's life right now, and you can feel the weight of it without being able to name it. Maybe you have been the patient one, the quiet one, the one who kept showing up and doing the work while someone else controlled the story. Here is what I know after 61 years and this particular chapter of my life. The truth does not need your help to be true. It only needs someone willing to follow the circuit all the way back to where it broke and show the room what is actually there. Do that once, in the right place, with the right documentation, and the lie stops being load-bearing. And when a lie stops being load-bearing, everything built on top of it comes down on its own. You do not have to be loud. You do not have to be angry. You just have to be patient enough to follow the wire. That is my story. A small town, a manufactured lie, a father who finally stopped being polite, and a courthouse that only wanted to know what could be proved. If it reached you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me whether you would have stayed patient or whether you would have moved sooner, because I am genuinely curious and I read every single one. Hit the like button if a quiet kind of justice is your thing. Subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories and turn on your notifications because we have more stories where this one came from. And I will see you in the next one.